The Ottomans and the sea. In the century after the occupation of Gallipoli in 1354, the only sea passages that were vital to the integrity of the Ottoman Empire were at the straits which divided its Asian and European territories. This situation changed with the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. The new Ottoman capital was a city whose existence depended on the supply of foodstuffs and other goods by sea, and this required a fleet to protect the ports and sea lanes from pirates and enemy action. 1 It was soon after 1453, too, that the Sultan began to use the fleet as an instrument of conquest, with Mytilene in 1462, and Negroponte in 1470, falling to amphibious assaults. It was only in the last years of the 15th century, with actions against Venice in the Gulf of Corinth, and off the southern and western Peloponnesos, that the Ottoman fleet began to operate outside the Aegean. In the second decade of the 16th century, however, two events occurred which made it necessary to extend the operating range of the fleet. The first of these was a land conquest. In 1517 Selim I conquered Egypt and, in the next decade, the province became an important source of food for the capital and revenue for the Sultan. Communication was practical only by sea, and it therefore became essential for the Sultan to maintain a fleet that was able to protect shipping between Istanbul and Egypt. The need to keep this route free from marauders must have been a reason for the assault on the piratical Knights of Rhodes, in 1522. The conquest of Egypt also brought the Sultan revenues from the trade between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. This, however, involved a naval conflict with the Portuguese who, in the same decades, had established themselves in the Indian Ocean, and were attempting to divert Rade from its old route through the Red Sea, and to gain a monopoly for their own vessels. The acquisition of the holy cities also made the Sultan responsible for keeping safe, from the Portuguese and other predators, the pilgrimage routes through the Red Sea from South Asia and Africa. The second event encouraging the Ottomans to strengthen the fleet was the submission to the Sultan of Hayreddin Barbarossa, the ruler of Algiers. This extended Ottoman realms to the western Mediterranean and, in the Sultan, gave Algiers a protector against Spain. Later in the century, the conquests of Tripoli in 1551, Djerba in 1560 and Tunis in 1574 strengthened the Ottoman presence in North Africa, but also, like the acquisition of Algiers, led to an inevitable naval rivalry with Spain, which was also seeking to establish strongholds on the North African coast. These factors made the possession of an effective fleet essential as much to the survival of the empire as to its expansion. Ships Murad I, 1362-89, may have built warships at Gallipoli after retaking the town and its harbor from the Byzantines in 1377, but the first reliable record of an Ottoman fleet dates from 1392, during the reign of Bayezid I, 1389-1402. It was, however, Mehmed II, 1451-81, who began to construct ships on a large scale for wars of conquest. Details of these early war fleets are lacking, but it is clear that, in building them, Ottoman shipwrights simply adopted the types of vessel that were common throughout the Mediterranean. 2. The basic fighting vessel was the oared galley. In the form in which it had emerged during the Middle Ages, the galley was a narrow vessel, 5 to 8 times as long as it was broad. A standard galley had 24 to 26 banks of oars on either side, with usually 3 oarsmen to each bench. A raised platform ran between the banks on either side. It carried a single mast with a lateen sail, and had a fighting platform at the prow. Light galleys, which corsairs especially favored, had fewer than 24 rowing benches on each side, while heavy galleys, such as carried a fleet commander, had 26 or more. On the prow, they carried a ram which seems to have had the function of damaging the hulls of enemy ships and of pinning them down during hand-to-hand fighting. The fundamentals of galley design did not change between the Middle Ages and the 18th century, when the galley finally disappeared from the Mediterranean. There were, however, some modifications over the centuries. The most important of these was the addition of artillery in the second half of the 15th century. Galleys carried their guns forward, allowing them to fire on the enemy before grappling and boarding. When the Ottoman fleet first used shipboard artillery is not clear, but certainly a Venetian woodcut depicting the battle off the Peloponnesos in 1499 shows the Ottoman galleys with a single large swivel cannon, mounted on a vertical post at the center of the prow. 3 During the 16th century, as on land, bronze cannon replaced wrought iron ones, and the number of guns increased. The standard for Ottoman galleys in the 16th century was probably the same as Katib Çelebi specified as standard in the mid-17th, that is a centerline cannon, throwing a ball of about 30 pounds or more, flanked by 2 culverins. 4. The addition of artillery was the most important development in galley design during the 15th century. Further modifications occurred during the 16th and 17th. Until the mid-16th century, the standard galley had 3 oarsmen to a bench, with each oarsman pulling a separate oar, a system known in Italian as alla sensile. In the mid-century, all Mediterranean fleets seemed to have converted to a system where the oarsman on a single bench pulled a single oar, a system known as al scalaccio. The new arrangement made it possible to increase the number of oarsmen on a bench and reduced the number of skilled oarsmen required. 5. The Ottoman fleet, to judge from Venetian reports, adopted the al scalaccio system in about 1560. Another change came towards the end of the century, when standard galleys began to carry 2 rather than 1 mast. 6. Ottoman shipbuilders also made this modification. In the 17th century, too, they began to build galleys with a melon stern, that is, a stern which was rounded and reinforced, to make it more resistant to the waves. A final small change came when the Admiral, Ali Chelebi, held office. 1617, 1618-19 abolished as superfluous the life-saver, a sail which crews used to help refloat galleys which had run aground. A more significant development in 16th century galley design came about by accident. In 1570, when Venice began to construct a fleet to counter the Ottoman attack on Cyprus, the Arsenal shipwrights converted 10 merchant galleys into warships. This was an improvisation, but one that was highly successful. Merchant galleys were slower and more cumbersome than war galleys, but more capacious, and so allowed the shipbuilders to mount extra guns, including artillery that could fire broadsides. The extra height also allowed the vessels to dominate ordinary war galleys in battle. 8. The Spanish commander of the fleet of the Holy League, Colonna, certainly recognized the potential of these vessels when, in answering objections to his plan to pursue the Ottoman fleet in 1570, he noted that these Venetian galasses were like fortresses towering over and firing down upon the enemy. 9. The Battle of Lepanto in the following year justified his optimism. The galasses played a major role in the Holy League's victory over the Ottomans. The technology of the galass was, however, conservative, and it was a ship that the Ottomans could easily imitate. In the winter following the defeat at Lepanto, the Imperial Council instructed the chief shipwright of the arsenal to construct a ship, which should be propelled by oars and capable of firing guns from its stern, bow and sides, without harming the oarsmen. When the Admiral, Ulyaj Ali, had approved the plans, the arsenal at Sinop constructed 3 and the Istanbul arsenal 1 or 2 of the new vessels and, from 1572, galasses formed a regular part of the Ottoman fleet. 10. Katib Chelebi records that, in the mid-17th century, they carried 24 guns. 11. The ease with which the Ottoman shipwrights imitated the Venetian galass contrasts with their tardiness in introducing galleons, that is sailing vessels with high sides, and capable of firing broadsides. In this respect, however, they were typical of Mediterranean shipbuilders in general. The Venetians built a few warships of this kind in the late 15th century, inspiring Mehmed II to order a similar ship from the Istanbul arsenal. Mehmed's Bargia, however, sank on launching. 12. And neither the Venetian nor the Ottoman arsenals continued to experiment with these vessels. The only exceptions were a pair of Kakas that fought with the Ottoman fleet in 1499. These were hybrid vessels, with oars, but with the upper work and sails of a galleon. Except, it seems, in this one year, the galley in its various forms was the only Ottoman fighting vessel. 13. This was also true of the other Mediterranean navies and, until the 17th century, put the Ottoman fleet at no disadvantage against its Mediterranean rivals. The Ottoman Empire, however, was not solely a Mediterranean power and, in its encounters with the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf, the Ottoman galleys could not withstand the superior firepower of the Portuguese carracks, and were not suitable for navigation in the ocean. In the 17th century, they faced a similar problem in the Mediterranean. This century saw the appearance there of armed merchantmen from Holland, France, and England, since, in most circumstances, a galley was no match for a fully armed galleon. This changed the methods of Mediterranean warfare, and persuaded the Venetian arsenal to begin galleon construction. In consequence, when the Ottomans declared war on Venice in 1645, and launched an attack on Crete, they confronted a navy that was technologically superior to their own. To match the Venetian fleet, the Ottomans began to build galleons, with 10 under construction. In 1650, however, neither the ships themselves, nor the attempts to muster technically proficient crews were successful, and it was not until 1682 that the galleon became the standard warship in the Ottoman fleet. The North Africans, however, mastered the techniques of building and manning galleons well before the craftsmen. and sailors of the Ottoman fleet. This was perhaps because the regencies of Algiers, Tunis and Tripoli attracted corsairs from northern Europe as well as from the Mediterranean, and it was perhaps these men who transferred the skills from the Atlantic seaboard. This is not to say that the Ottoman naval arsenals produced no sailing ships at all. A document of 1,487 records 2 sailing vessels, a bargia and a griper, carrying respectively 83 and 45 guns. 14 These clearly were artillery transports, and it was as transport vessels that Ottoman barges continued to function throughout the 16th century. One of these even accompanied a galley fleet to the Indian Ocean in 1564, but apparently carried only provisions and was not armed. In addition to barges, other specialized vessels accompanied the Ottoman war fleets. Documents list, but do not describe, stone ships, presumably for the transport of cannon balls or materials for the repair of harbors and fortifications, and horse ships and apos. These, according to a 17th century account, were square-rigged vessels with a shallow draft for the transport of horses or artillery, with an opening at the poop to take on horses. 15 These were the ships that accompanied the Mediterranean fleet. Other specialized vessels served on the navigable rivers of the empire.